Are you ready?
The output of our tool is a living, dynamic, single source of truth for what it is that you're going to build.
The world's changing.
The text-to-speech will all stay inside of the buyer's environment.
That makes total sense.
Imagine the world 10 years from now. What's it look like? If you're successful and you're right,
Say your name actually one more time to the mic.
Echo
awesome.
Wu.
That's funny. Did you do that on purpose? Was that a good joke? You said echo twice?
No.
Okay.
we'll cut it that way.
You're going to have a minute to pitch and then get some feedback. Are you feeling ready?
Yeah.
All right. You have a minute. Echo, what are you building?
We are building software for hardware, especially complex systems that involve both hardware and software components. Think a car, a plane, a nuclear reactor, or International Space Station if we want to go big. My co-founder he has a PhD in nuclear engineering, and he lived very much in the boring world of requirements management. And we think that this is where AI can come in and play a big role. The role that we really want to streamline and optimize for is called a systems engineer. Those are the type of engineers that sit very central to these complex systems and then coordinate the communication around the very specialized various engineering teams around them. We launched last year. We have done over 70 discovery interviews, converted 8 design partnerships, and have 1 sales partner.
Awesome.
Under a minute. Good job.
That was great.
Thanks.
That's not easy to do. It's not easy to do.
Cut out that part, please.
As venture capitalists, we have to pitch a lot of investors ourselves, and I can't do our pitch in under a minute, Mel. So I just want to
Thank you.
So I think the thing I'm still unclear on, it's really interesting. You've set up actually a nice world and problem, and if you solve it, it makes sense to me from an economic perspective. I'm a big product UX person when it comes to pitches. I'm having a struggle to experience or feel your UX, not having been in this space. Tell me a little bit more. First, let's talk about without your product. What does a person who's the systems engineer who doesn't have your product today have to do, and what is the output of what they have to do?
Yeah. Okay. So using an incumbent tool, it's called Cameo. It's done by a French company. Very clunky in terms of user experience. It was designed a long time ago. There's a lot of clicking, a lot of boxes that you'd have to draw. If you'd look at the user interface, you just wouldn't like it. It looked like it was built a couple of generations ago. The output of it is a model. The model of what you want to build.
like the 3D, like the schematic model.
It doesn't have to be 3D. It could be 2D. But yes, the schematic.
But is it a model of the, this is the thing maybe that I'm most curious about, is it a model of like the product or the ways in which the product has firmware and software and hardware components that need to be manipulated?
It's everything together. So if you think about
it as it also what's used to print? Or is that separate? I guess that's the thing in my head that I was wondering this entire time. Is this used, because you kept referring to how teams will use this and this will improve teams, right?
Yeah.
Is that because this is a schematic that's almost like API documentation for everybody? And so that's why it's this really important thing, because it allows everyone who's working on this product to understand all the moving components, both software and hardware. And is it also what's used to build it in terms of it's also the exact dimensions and it's the physicality of it. I know the physicality has to be part of the first one, but there's a world where I think this is a separate thing that's happening.
Yeah. So it's not drawings, it's specifications.
Yeah.
Eventually, the output is going to allow you to send a chunk of it to your supplier to be like, I need 52 nuts or bolts of this size.
So it's no illustration whatsoever. It's all specifications.
Right.
That's maybe where I got the most lost in the middle.
Okay.
And I couldn't figure out exactly what, because you kept using the word model. And I loved the component of like you talking about this hardware software dynamic, but it made me imagine both. And I was like, I can't tell which one this is. So then the output's the specifications. And with your product, some of this answer is obvious. I'm somewhat prompting you to hear the juicy details. Why is AI going to be really good at this?
It can help generate the models. It can help explain the models itself to people who are not trained.
Let me ask differently. Why is it going to be better than a really good systems engineer at this?
Because schools now just started to teach model-based systems engineering.
No, a really good systems engineer already exists, and your thing exists.
Yeah.
With AI.
It saves them 6 months.
There's not more? I kind of have an answer in my head that is a guess. Can I give it to you?
Sometimes for some models, it takes 5 years. Okay, you can just give it to me
The thing I'm imagining I was hoping for a little bit was something like, if you think about system specification that come out of what a system engineer does, it's a lot of details that are about dependencies, edge cases, micro details that need to be covered, maybe even tested, maybe even back propagated in terms of, hey, what do I need to find out from the team and come back? And so the systems engineer, a really good one today, is going to spend 1 year, 2 years, 3 years on a really complicated product, a little bit less on smaller products, getting all these details and synthesizing it in a way where this specification document, that's a living document that needs to be updated, will finally be usable. And today, unfortunately, it gets kind of usable, and to maintain it is so expensive that it actually decays pretty quickly. And AI, if we have every other engineer involved, every other product person involved, feeding all of that data into a central model, chat, app, whatever it is going to be fantastic, because this is all rigid systems thinking work that AI is fantastic at, will be fast at, will be good at giving updates to. And so not only will it shortcut the budget and shortcut the timeline, but it's actually going to be quite a bit better than the human who does this today.
I love that you're pitching for me.
I feel like you cheated, though. It's like you knew this product already.
Well, that's the funny thing is I didn't know anything about the product at first. So I was like, oh, this model thing is really complicated to imagine. As soon as you said specifications doc, I went, AI is going to be amazing at this, because that's input of text and other physical details of text and output of structured thinking. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Every AI product that does that makes a ton of sense. This use case also sounds specific enough that like the moat you build on knowing what needs to be kind of contained with whatever model you're using feels like people buy that for the regulatory reason or safety reasons or whatever else is complicated about the engineering of these products. But that's what I'd emphasize. What I talked about, a shorter version of that in that minute pitch, will first of all help the person like me get unlost a little bit. Yeah. And then two, it'll be like, oh yeah, AI is going to be badass at this. And so the replacement or augment of an existing systems engineer is inevitable.
I have a question. Are you familiar with a company called Allspice?
No.
In this category? Okay. No. They're one of our investments, and they're focused on they've built like GitHub for hardware engineers. That's sort of been there, and they come from aerospace and other areas. And it's certainly a very different category than being a software engineer, like building for that. So I think it's ripe for disruption. I'd be curious about your entry point, because the systems engineer has a bunch of jobs. I always laugh because it reminds me of the scene from Office Space where he talks about taking the stuff from the engineers to I'm not sure. Okay, maybe nobody here has seen Office Space.
I like it.
Anyway, but part of their job is what you talked about. It's coordinating and bringing all this stuff together. Yeah. And I'm curious about what you've found in all of your research is that wedge. What is that like really burning pain moment that when you're talking about this, it like unlocks it for your potential buyer?
Yeah. So there are two very strong use cases that we're seeing. One is present tense use case, one is future tense use case. We don't do software coding. That's not the output from our tool. The output of our tool is a model, a diagram, a living, dynamic, single source of truth for what it is that you're going to build. Think of it as Jira plus the hardware. Yeah. So it's like where you could use Agile, but add all the parts and ports to every single requirement, so that when you build, the team knows what it is that they're doing. So the present tense use case really comes from the government. DoD, NASA, they're increasingly asking for what's called MBSE deliverables, MBSE, Model-Based Systems Engineering. It sounds like you're very much familiar with that. The problem with that is MBSE in a lot of engineering firms are either not implemented or implemented in a very incomplete way. They see that as, oh, this is something that we have to do in order to satisfy our... Exactly. Yeah. So they hire an MBSE engineer just for that reason. But the benefit of the MBSE methodology has not been realized.
Got it.
So we think by using AI, we cut out the steeper end of the learning curve, which has been a big contributor to why these really fantastic methodology haven't been completely implemented. And we see that there's just going to be more industries jumping onto this private sector especially. We see a lot of use cases where, especially like cruise, that they're really failing now. GM is shutting them down. If they had used MBSE, maybe something could have been reversed. We don't know.
Is it predominantly, you think the buyer buys, like, is it almost regulatory driven today? Like, because they have to do that?
Yeah.
Is there a future, though, where you view it as it's going to be beyond that? Like, do you think companies are already moving in that direction? Like, they want to adopt this? We start
to see that, and smaller firms especially. They realize, okay, they could run meetings. They could run Jira in a funky way.
Yeah.
But they'd rather not. So they'd rather have some kind of systems or documentation really in place, and everybody can refer to the model. The model explains itself.
Yeah. I think in your minute pitch, by the way, this sort of thing that is the world that these people live in requires this, I think is actually a pretty important, like, 5-second part of that.
Okay.
Because it definitely, it's a clear wedge. There's a number of companies going after various industries, and it's an amazing moment where you can take a specific area, whether it be compliance and you could say, it's like, it's going to be mandated anyway. Mm-hmm. So they can spend a lot of money on people and do it poorly, or technology can step in and help this, but they have to buy it no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I forgot to say the second piece of this, future tense. The modeling language itself is very difficult to learn. It's called SysML. It was launched, let's say, a couple of decades ago. It's been around for some time, and it's still running on version 1. There is a disruptor coming around the scene, V2, supposedly to be released this year. Could be also next year. There's a very large industry groups running this. And we think when that happens, really, that's going to be sort of the battle for the fittest in terms of vendors. That's what we are hearing from the discovery interviewees. And we think by building in V2, which is what we're doing now, we really established ourselves for that future use case.
Can you tell me a little bit about the business model behind this? You talk about the systems engineer.
Yeah.
That I presume you're replacing them, not really augmenting them.
Initially, we'd have to augment because the incumbent is a heavyweight. It's people's mental defaults when they're thinking about buying something. It's like you've heard of the saying, nobody ever gets fired for buying IBM. Yeah. That is kind of what we're up against.
The world's changing.
I know, yes, very much. But they do have the manpower.
Yeah.
Right now, we just can't say that we want to kill a giant, even though in the future, that's very much where we want to be.
Yeah.
So initially, we're just going to make their modeling experience a little easier, a little better.
Are you going to do it on top of this tool, by the way, at first?
Right now, yeah.
That's actually quite compelling as a story. I think when you're like, it's imagine like if you're building a Photoshop replacement, but the first go-to-market is building a plugin. Now you don't tell that to Photoshop that, hey, I'm a cool plugin, support me, and by the way, later I plan to eat you. But when you're talking to investors and talking about, hey, how do we think about a systems engineer today, and maybe for the next 4 years before they're truly replaced, we'll love something that makes the software much easier to use.
Yeah.
That's also a value prop that's distinct from everything else. Mm-hmm. For the sake of time, this has been fun. Any other notes for her?
No, this is great.
Great.
Good
Thank
stuff.
you.
Thank you. All right.
I will say the two things, though, that stuck out to me by the end were this last point that you talked about, the sort of the go-to-market being that it is a requirement, is an edge in this category. And the other one is this building on top of the existing system. I do think that's a good play. We have a company in our portfolio that's building AI for autonomous pathology to detect cancer cells. And their entry has been, we build software that can take the 8 hours of a pathologist's work and make it 30 minutes. And then they do the last 30 minutes because that's what the world expects.
Yep.
There aren't enough pathologists. It's not a job that most people want to do because you sit and stare into a microscope for 12 hours a day. And yet that's where you have to start. Yep. But that also makes it a compelling pitch because the labs already exist. They need to be more efficient.
I love that. Can I give you a framework that I've been started to think about with AI startups?
Sure.
Replacement's coming for some amount of jobs, sure. But I think for a lot of people, and especially in the midterm, most people who have specialized jobs or places where their subject matter expertise become orchestrators, supervisors, or editors of AI models, where we put them at the last mile, or let's say the last 20% of the work. And I think for startup founders who are pitching these sorts of solutions, they often struggle in their head. They're like, oh, I don't want to say replace. I want to one day because that'll be my business exploding. I don't want to say replace, but I don't want to say that I'm not going to replace them. What do I say to, toe the perfect line, both with an investor, by the way, but also their customer?
Yeah.
Do you go to the customer and say, I want to replace you? Or to the customer's boss and say, I want to replace you? But if you use this orchestration, supervision, or editor line, you say, hey, well, I want to make your person in this example, I would think of them as maybe a combination of orchestrator and supervisor.
Yeah.
At the last 20%. Then I think everyone can kind of go, okay, I get that eventually you're probably going to be more. But today, putting that person in that seat is an optimization on everything going on.
Yeah, and I think it's a pretty clear if anybody here is using any sort of AI tools in their personal or professional lives, it's pretty clear today, like AI replaces tasks, not people yet. Maybe one day that'll be different, but we still think we're fairly far out from that. Yeah, Sam Altman, maybe we're closer, but this is sort of where we're going. And so, yeah, I think you do start with that. You say there's a bunch of tasks that happen. AI would do way better. Somebody's still got to start it, keep an eye on it, give it other feedback whenever it stops and runs into a roadblock. I mean, this is the Tesla, autopilot, right? Yeah. You still got to be behind the wheel for now.
Yeah, so. Exactly. I like that. Nice round up.
Yeah.
Round of applause from the founder of 4. I have to say, I'm jealous of the flowing.
I like the confidence. Love 50 seconds instead of 60.
What's your name?
Michael.
Michael, you're going to have a minute to pitch and get some feedback. You feeling ready?
I am.
Awesome. You have a minute. What are you building?
I'm Michael. I'm a CEO. I'm an engineer. Tensor 9 is a product that enables SaaS vendors to unlock Fortune 500 and regulated customers that can't share sensitive data. The way we accomplish this is by making it easy for the SaaS vendor to automatically convert their product to run inside of the inside of the customer's environment, in their cloud or in their data center. Therefore, the sensitive data stays where it stays put and doesn't leave. So let me give you an example. No doubt you've both been in a meeting with an automated note taker. It's a great product. Sits in your meetings, records it, takes notes. Super useful. But a vendor of such a product faces a very long, risky, challenging uphill sales process selling to, let's say, a bank or a big law firm. The bank is going to say, I love your product, but I couldn't possibly let you sit in my meetings and take away recordings. So it's not going to happen. And so what Tensor 9 does is it makes it easy for that vendor to convert their product so that it runs inside the bank and the meetings stay with the bank.
That's a minute. Don't worry. We're going to hear more.
Thank you.
Super compelling so far. Finish that thought.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that it eliminates the sales friction, makes it easier to close a deal, and that we have some traction. We've helped about 12 customers last year, all in the voice AI space. We've earned about six figures in revenue last year.
So can you talk a little bit about how? You don't have to go too detailed, but I just want to understand. So I'm viewing this as almost like a hypervisor play, like what VMware did, and or
it's an interesting analogy.
Yeah. But I guess I'm curious about like your take on the how, and it sounds like there's specific maybe modes, the voice being the first one you're approaching.
Yeah. So in terms of the how, the idea is to take this existing product and run it inside of a different remote environment. And so this is very challenging. The way folks do this today typically is to use something like Kubernetes. They find a form factor that is common, but that is expensive. That is an expensive transition from the software that they've built for the cloud to transition it to run in this other form factor that's very different operationally. And it has limitations. For example, you can't use managed services. And what's more is that there are different customer environments that a vendor might have to target. Some of their customers may be air-gapped, for example, in which case there's no external connectivity. Some of their customers may want to use Kubernetes. Some of them may be in the cloud. And what ends up happening is that for a vendor to target these various customers, they end up having multiple products. Mm-hmm. They have their SaaS product, they have their Kubernetes product, they have their cloud product. So this is bring your own cloud or cloud prem. There's a litany of terms here. And they end up having to build, maintain, and support these. So what we have is a system that will build an internal representation of that vendor's software and then compile it into a form suitable for deployment into various customer environments, wherever the customer needs it. And so we can compile to Kubernetes, we can compile to AWS, Azure, GCP. We can compile to a form that's suitable for air-gapped environments. And what we do is we stitch the experience together so that it's very easy for the vendor to both deploy continuously as well as observe their software continuously. So from the vendor's perspective, what they see is that they just deploy their stack normally, and Tensor 9 behind the scenes automatically will synchronize that into various customer environments. And further, the observability we stitch together as well. So what the vendor will see is that their logs and metrics simply show up. We call it continuous observability. There's some nuances there. In the case of an air-gapped environment, it's not continuous. It is semi-continuous. Okay? So that's the general idea. We save the vendor from having to think about these multiple environments. We save the vendor from having to convert their software from one form into another and from having to maintain multiple products.
So good answer. Give us a little bit more of the literal how, because that sounds great when you say we're going to kind of translate into something that can be deployed in all these environments. But I want to know a little bit more of, if it's not the secret to sauce, some of the secret sauce.
Yeah. So what we do is we require the vendor to be using infrastructure as code. So this is a CloudFormation, Terraform, Pulumi, and this is a definition of the stack.
Yeah.
So we take that, we lift it into our own representation, and then we modify it, right? So if you're, the easiest case is where both the vendor and the customer are in the same cloud.
Yeah.
So that's easy. We kind of stitch together the deployment and the observability. In the case where the customer is in a different cloud, we basically look for like replacements and or require the customer to also have.
So is this in a consulting arrangement or like an implementation arrangement at first? The first time you're doing that for my product as a vendor, I'm your customer.
No, it is a self-service product.
It is self-service.
It is a self-service product.
How do you tell me more about how that happens, right? Because that sounds complicated from the perspective of like, okay, I built it for certain environments and for certain deployment, and you're going to make it kind of work in these other form factors. That feels like a hard engineering challenge.
It is, yeah. So the way that works is, like we said, we've got this infrastructure as code definition. Yeah. And so what we do, there's a lot of depth here, but we have a set of services that we cover. So compute is pretty easy to kind of move into this on the environment. Where there are managed services, we'll either require the customer to also have an account in the same cloud. Basically, that's what we'll do. And if the customer has an air-gapped environment or they want to use Kubernetes, we'll do a like-for-like replacement from the managed service to an open source basically version of that managed service. So that's where there is some upfront work in the case that
the customer is doing it.
In the case that the vendor is using a managed service that we've not yet mapped. But that's kind of like choose your customers wisely and then build out a library over time. And then over time, we've got this muscle developed around being able to replace managed services with these open source equivalents.
So I'm going to give us feedback for a second, which is in these very technical pitches, I think we should be mindful as investors to not go too deep in the first conversation. We almost have to suspend disbelief. And I believe what you're saying is possible. And so I want to pull it back up a little bit just because I don't want to spend all of the 10 or 12 minutes on that.
Sure.
I'm curious about, there's been a promise for a long time that both companies can deliver multi-cloud products and that customers want multi-cloud products. As in, if they're going to run it in their own environment, they want to be able to run their stuff on GCP and also Amazon or one region and another. Yeah. You're solving a problem that seems like a pretty big problem for SaaS companies, and we invest in a lot of these companies. Yeah. We're large investors in MongoDB. We obviously get a lot of requests from companies all over the world that want to run it in other environments. How have you found your initial customers? You said choose your customers wisely. Who are they? Yeah,
so the initial customers are all in the voice AI space. One of our customers is a company called Play AI. They do text to speech, and that was just was doing demos for friends. One of them got a job at that company and they said, hey, we need your product. And so that's where we're operating now. The way we think about that space is, so the voice AI space is separated into layers. There's the text to speech layer. They're the primitives. So this is text to speech, speech to text. There's the platform layer. These are chatbot platforms like Vappy, for example. And then there are applications. So these are like contact centers. And they're directly interfacing with the regulated companies, the customers. And so right now we're selling into that lower tier, but there's an interesting thing where, ultimately it is the bank or the hospital that wants on-premise. Yeah. And so it creates this sort of vacuum to suck in all three of those layers into the on-premise deployment. And so what is interesting is that we've got our primitive play, but then what happens is that if one of our primitive customers is selling to a platform or an application who themselves want to sell on premise, it creates an opportunity to convert our customers' into our customers, which we've done. So one of our customers we acquired that way. So there's an interesting kind of go-to-market play there.
And so how far, you've got these handful of customers, how far on the journey have you sort of tested? So there's a reason why you've now got voice, you know, sort of application. This is sort of the area you continue to go down. Are you beginning to go into other areas, or do you want to really focus on this and like own this category first?
No, we're in this space now. We just kind of stumbled upon it. There's some sort of, I wouldn't call it product market fit, but some fit there. But where we're moving to is to companies kind of late series A, Series B that want to cross the enterprise chasm. Yeah. So there's pressure to have these larger accounts, and they're not quite sure how to meet all the demands of the enterprise. And so there are a bunch of companies operating in this space. WorkOS is one of them. They kind of take a different approach. They do the single sign-on stuff. We're helping with the on-prem and the bring your own cloud. So we kind of want to catch them at that time where they either they've thought enough about it, what it would take. They realize it's expensive. They've maybe done an engineering exercise to estimate it, or they've actually tried to cross and have regretted it. We've run into this pattern a lot where they realize that they end up having multiple products, and it's in that zone that there's an opportunity to convince them to buy the product. So that's the stage. And in terms of the verticals, it's legal tech. It is cybersecurity. It is deep fake detection. Got it. There are more. I think this is broadly applicable, but those are the ones where...
That's where you're initially focused.
Yeah.
No, it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. Are you technical?
I'm an engineer. Yeah.
And you're CEO?
I'm the CEO, yeah.
You're very poised and you're technical.
Thank you.
And so I'm going to disagree a little bit with Jesse here and give you some feedback. I think you're going to be capable of convincing a lot of people who either won't understand quickly enough, or like me, will get a little bit, I want to, you said that question, do I believe you? I don't disbelieve you. I trust you. So I don't want to say I don't believe you. But I whenever I hear a pitch, I want to know that I understand that it works, even early on. I don't want to get into the details. To Jesse's point, some stuff should be saved for meeting too. You have the ability to communicate. And so some technical co-founders don't, or technical founders don't. So you have an opportunity in your case to figure out the analogies and the stories. I'm a semi-technical product person by background. So I usually fancy myself capable of understanding these sorts of products pretty quickly. And I'm going to ask my question only one more time, but this time I'm not, might be for a variety of reasons. So maybe the thing I'm getting stuck on when it's serving as infrastructure, when I'm the buyer. So again, we're a voice application. What am I doing to be ready, right? So like, you're going to sell me this value prop. I get it.
Here's how it works. We do this several times a week. So the buyer experience is the following. We ask them to provision. So far, they've all been willing to use a cloud environment. So we ask them to make a new AWS account or do a GCP project. And we give them a little script that has baked into it all the credentials and the things that they need. And that script, they run it in their Cloud Shell. And it provisions the infrastructure. And then that thing, we call it an appliance, is sitting inside of the buyer's environment. It has a control plane connection back to the vendor's controller in their environment. And then the vendor's controller is going to provision hardware and then start deploying the software.
So let me see if I have this right in the flow chart in my head. Like essentially the thing that I might have gotten stuck on that I think is clearing up for me, you're actually still running on that initial GCP instance, let's say, and you're doing like the forward pass of the product with the customer. So it's not the entire thing going to the customer. It's the stuff that needs to be on the customer is coming back for the application layer.
The control plane lives in the vendor's cloud. It does provisioning, the data plane. So let's make it concrete.
That makes total sense.
The text to speech will all stay inside of the buyer's environment. The text goes into the buyer's appliance in their GCP or their AWS, and the speech comes out from the buyers.
So this is so cool. Now let me tell you where I got lost so that you can, it might have been my fault, but still cater to not having that happen, which is at some point, I guess I didn't realize that's what was happening. And so I was like, how are you transforming what they're doing with just a script? Like you're redeploying an entire application somehow on their customer's cloud, like in their infrastructure. Like what magic script is this that's like rebuilding these applications? As soon as I realized that, hey, there's that distinction between, let's call it customer output of the application. So the application stays with the vendor who owns it and runs it and is updating it. And you're basically bifurcating the output of the application. That's where I don't know where I got lost, but I got lost somewhere there.
I would still go back to what I said, though. In a short pitch, I wouldn't get lost in this. Like, we have a company in our portfolio that basically translates anything written for CUDA into every other chipset to run AI models. They're out of MIT. They're up in Boston. That whole pitch, they basically talk about that, and they say, well, every single model that exists out there can only run, most of them basically can only run on NVIDIA. There's not enough chips. The chips cost 10 times more than everything else. That's the opportunity. And at that point, as long as I can suspend disbelief long enough, I'm like, well, tell me how this is going to be massive. Like, this is huge. And that's why I jumped to the VMware example. I'm like, it's such a big idea. Run whatever software you want on any other hardware kind of thing. Run whatever application you have as a vendor, as a company that makes software in another environment, I think is a big enough idea that you'll get me hooked in the first conversation. If you have an hour to talk, great. But if you have 14 minutes, it's harder to do that. So
in general, that's super cool. Thanks for walking through, and good luck with it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I like how you encapsulated that with the example of the portfolio company you have. I imagined too much in this case.
I was going to ask this question. How many people in the audience here, by just a quick show of hands, are building like very technical products? Like deep, like they're hard tech, or not hard tech, but yet technical. A few of you got what I was saying. I'm not very clear. I think one of the challenges in building really like magical technical products is the magic is what you are selling. And in the world that we live in, where anything's possible, you often find the need, and people will drag you down this rabbit hole of like, explain it to me. Number one, it's okay sometimes to say that's my secret sauce. Like, I'm not getting there right now. Number two, it's also okay to say, like, just imagine, you talked about this, like, imagine the world looks like this, and this is how it works. Like, extract the layer of technical from it. Even if you can explain it, there's time for that. But in your first conversation, it's never. You know what I'm realizing?
I give the feedback a lot here. You're making me realize something. I'm actually going to say, I don't know if that happened just to me with his, but it might be an improvement he can make on his pitch. He probably gave me a few too many details. And I give this feedback to non-technical founders too. If an investor begins to ask you detailed questions that you think are kind of nanny-y in their nature, you probably actually turn them down the wrong street. And you need to actually bring them back, to your point, to the narrative. And so again, it might have been me, might have been something he said that like got me to think a little bit too much, how are you doing this? But I love your point. Keep people in that plane and, you know, say, hey, here's where we are on narrative. If we wound up here, I accidentally said something that triggered you to wonder that actually I want to remove the variable. I want to remove the ability for you to think about that for now.
And by the way, in most pitches, you have a deck. I don't care if you have a deck. I've backed founders who don't, who just have a Notion doc or a Google doc. The vast majority of people benefit from having a deck, and it's for this reason. That you can say either, I'm going to get to that later, like totally appreciate the question, or like, let's talk about it, but in the context of this like slide that I have that I can visualize with you. Obviously, they don't get that benefit here, so it's not fair to them, but like it's helpful in doing that because you'll find yourself going down this rabbit hole. And we're as guilty of asking the questions because we're curious as founders are of then answering the question that we asked and being like, I'm going to get you to understand everything I understand.
Totally. No, and that's I love where we got to for this. Good advice for technical and complicated product founders.